Welcome to the peaceful space of sleep-friendly science, where we explore the planet's deepest and quietest mystery, a time when evolution itself seemed to hold its breath for 1 billion years. Tonight, we journey into this profound planetary pause, an era of strange stability known as the Boring Billion. What was happening in the silent oceans of this long-ago Earth that put the brakes on creation? If you find comfort in these deep explorations, a quiet like or subscribe helps our community grow. Now settle in, take a deep breath, and let the soft sounds guide you as we begin tonight's journey into the unknown. Section 1. The World's First Breath. Let us travel back in your mind, not to a time of grand creatures or towering forests, but to a world that is, in its own way, even more alien. We are going back 2.5 billion years. The Earth is already ancient, but it is a stranger to us. The sky is not blue. It is a hazy, faintly orange or pinkish dome, colored by a methane-rich atmosphere. The oceans are not the familiar sapphire of our world. They are a murky olive green. They are green with dissolved iron. Breathe in the air of this ancient world. It is thin and it holds no oxygen. To us it would be suffocating, but to the life that exists here it is home. And what is that life? It is entirely microscopic. A planet ruled by the small. In the warm, shallow waters, vast communities of bacteria and archaea thrive. They are anaerobic, meaning the very oxygen that gives us life would be a deadly poison to them. They live in a delicate balance, in a world that has been stable for eons. They are the undisputed masters of a quiet, green water planet. But among them a new power is stirring. A particular kind of bacteria, the cyanobacteria, has stumbled upon a new kind of magic. They have learned to do something revolutionary. They have learned to eat sunlight. Through photosynthesis they take in water and carbon dioxide, and with the energy of the sun they create sugar for themselves. It is a miracle of self-sufficiency. But every miracle has a consequence. Every process creates waste. And the waste product of this new, powerful form of photosynthesis was a gas the world had never known in any great quantity. A ghost of a gas. It was oxygen. For millions of years this was not a problem. The tiny whisper of poison being exhaled by the cyanobacteria was immediately neutralized. The world had a vast built-in defense system. That defense was the dissolved iron in the oceans. As soon as a molecule of oxygen was released, it would bump into an iron atom and bind with it, forming a new substance, rust. Imagine a slow, steady rain, not of water but of rust, falling through the green oceans century after century. The iron, once dissolved and invisible, was now being pulled out of the water, settling on the seafloor in fine reddish-brown layers. This process went on for an unimaginable length of time, creating the vast deposits we now call banded iron formations, the source of most of the iron we use today. The planet was, in effect, holding its breath, soaking up the poison as fast as it was being made. The ancient anaerobic life continued its reign, oblivious to the slow chemical time bomb that was ticking away in the water around it. But no sponge can soak forever. After hundreds of millions of years the job was done. The great iron sink was full. The oceans had been cleared of their dissolved iron. Now, when the cyanobacteria exhaled their oxygen, there was nothing left in the water to immediately catch it. For the first time, free oxygen began to accumulate in the seas. The change was catastrophic. This was the Great Oxidation Event. It was not an event in the human sense, not something that happened on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a slow-motion apocalypse that unfolded over millions of years. For the ruling anaerobic life of the planet, it was the end of the world. Their home, their water, their air was becoming toxic. Oxygen, to them, was a corrosive, destructive force that tore apart their delicate cellular machinery. This was the planet's first and perhaps greatest mass extinction. There was no battle, no struggle. It was a great planetary silencing. The world was remade. As oxygen filled the atmosphere, it cleared the methane haze. The The sky, for the first time in Earth's history, turned blue. The oceans, now stripped of their iron, lost their greenish hue and became clear. The world took its first true breath of the air we now know. It was a revolution, a violent and dramatic transformation. A planet had been poisoned and reborn. You would expect this to be the start of something incredible. With this new high-energy molecule of oxygen available, you would expect evolution to burst forth, to seize this new potential and run with it, creating bigger, more complex, more wonderful forms of life. The revolution was over. The stage was set for greatness. And then nothing happened. For the next billion years, the story of life on Earth goes strangely quiet. The frantic, world-changing pace of evolution seems to grind to a halt. The blue sky, the clear oceans, the new oxygen-rich world, it all just sits there. This is the great mystery we have come to explore. Why, after such a violent birth, did the new world fall into such a long and profound slumber? Section 2. An ocean of stillness. Following the chaos and violence of the Great Oxidation event, a strange and profound quiet descends upon the planet. The Earth, having been fundamentally remade, seems to settle into a new kind of existence. This is the beginning of the period we have come to investigate, an era so seemingly uneventful that scientists have given it a deceptively simple name: the Boring Billion. It stretches roughly from 1.8 billion years ago to about 800 million years ago, 1,000 million years, a quarter of our planet's entire history. And on the surface, it is an age defined by what did not happen. Let us paint a picture of this quiet world. The sky is blue, but perhaps a paler, thinner blue than our own. The sun is a little less bright, emitting about 85% of its modern-day energy. The continents, having gathered after the Great Oxidation into the supercontinent Columbia, and later Rodinia, are vast, empty, and sterile landscapes of reddish-brown rock. There is no soil, no green mantle of plants to soften the view. The land is a silent desert, eroded by wind and the occasional rain, but fundamentally lifeless. The true story of this eon is happening in the oceans. Imagine yourself floating in the warm, clear waters of a shallow sea on this ancient Earth. The water is startlingly clear. There is no visible life, no fish darting by, no seaweed waving in the currents. But the silence is deceptive. Life is here, but it is a world of the small, a world of microbes. The water is a thin soup of bacteria and the newly evolved, more complex single-celled organisms, the eukaryotes. They are the rulers of this planet, the undisputed masters of the Boring Billion. And for a billion years, that is all there is. The fossil record, our great stone library of life's history, falls strangely silent. Before this period, we see the drama of the banded iron formations, the chemical signature of a world at war with oxygen. After this period, we see the first faint ghosts of complex animals in the Ediacaran fossils, and then the riot of creation in the Cambrian explosion. But in the vast chapter between them, the pages are almost blank. The rate of evolution, which had been so dynamic, slows to a crawl. The microbes that dominate the oceans seem to change very little. The same basic forms of single-celled life persist, millennium after millennium, with no great leaps in complexity, no major innovations. The eukaryotic cell, that brilliant invention with its nucleus and internal power plants, had already been created. But it seems to go nowhere. For a billion years it remains a single cell, content to float in the ocean, apparently with no ambition to become anything more. The planet itself seems to have settled into a period of extraordinary stability. Geologically, after the initial assembly of the supercontinent Columbia, the Earth's tectonic engine appears to have quieted down. The great cycle of mountain building and erosion, which acts like a pump, delivering vital nutrients from the land into the sea, seems to have slowed. The planet was stable. The climate was stable. The oceans were stable. And life, it seems, was stable too. It is this stability that is the heart of the mystery. Evolution thrives on change, on challenges, on new opportunities. A dynamic, changing environment creates new niches to be filled, new problems to be solved, and it drives the engine of natural selection. But what if the world itself becomes boring? Scientists call this period an evolutionary stasis. It is as if life reached a certain level of success, the successful single-celled organism, perfectly adapted to a stable, unchanging ocean, and then saw no reason to go further. It was a holding pattern, a planetary pause. Imagine a chess game that has reached a perfect stalemate. Every piece is in its place, perfectly balanced against every other piece. No move can be made to improve one's position without opening up a fatal weakness. And so, the players simply sit for 1,000 million years without making a move. This is the world of the boring billion. The mystery deepens when we consider what was not happening. There was no concerted effort to build larger bodies. There was no development of tissues, organs, or complex systems. There were no animals, no predators, no prey. The great dance of life, the chase and the escape, the intricate web of interactions that defines our modern ecosystems, had not yet begun. Why? What was holding life back? Was the planet itself the prison, locking life into this simple form? Or was there something about life itself during this period that resisted change? This is the central question. It is a question that forces us to look not just at the fossils, but at the chemistry of the ancient oceans, the geology of the lost continents, and the very air the world was breathing. We must become detectives, searching for the subtle clues that can explain this profound, billion-year-long quiet. We must understand the nature of the cage that kept life simple for so long. Section 3. The humble protagonists. To understand why this billion-year story seems so quiet, we must first meet its main characters. Let us shrink down, leaving our human scale behind, and enter the microscopic world of the ancient oceans. The stage is vast, but the cast of players is remarkably small. They are the humble protagonists of the boring billion, the organisms that defined an entire eon. The first and oldest group of characters are the prokaryotes. This is a vast and ancient kingdom that includes all bacteria and archaea. Their defining feature is their simplicity. A prokaryotic cell is like a small one-room workshop. It has a cell wall and a membrane, and inside its genetic material its DNA floats freely in a loop, along with all the other tools and machinery needed for life. There is no central office, no specialized compartments. Everything happens together in one bustling, efficient space. The masters of this world are still the cyanobacteria. They are the planet's primary producers, the foundation of the entire food web. They float in the sunlit upper layers of the ocean, the photic zone, silently harvesting the faint light of the distant sun. They are incredibly successful, perfectly adapted to their environment. They have no need for anything more. They are the patient, silent farmers of this world, and their slow, steady production of oxygen maintains the new state of the planet's atmosphere. Living alongside them and below them are countless other forms of bacteria and archaea. Some have adapted to live on the oxygen produced by the cyanobacteria, developing the machinery for aerobic respiration. But there is another character on this stage, a newcomer who holds the key to the future. This is the eukaryote. If a prokaryote is a one-room workshop, a eukaryote is a sprawling, complex factory with many different departments. The eukaryotic cell arose before the boring billion began, through a revolutionary act of partnership. An ancient archaeal cell engulfed a bacterium, but instead of digesting it, it put it to work. That engulfed bacterium became the mitochondrion, a specialized department dedicated to energy production. It was the cell's power plant, capable of using oxygen to generate vast amounts of energy compared to its prokaryotic cousins. This new cell also did something else crucial. It built a central office. It gathered its long, complex strands of DNA and enclosed them within a protective membrane, creating the nucleus. This protected the precious genetic blueprints and allowed for more complex gene regulation. This new organism with its nucleus, its mitochondria, and other specialized internal compartments was a quantum leap in biological complexity. It was the ancestor of every plant, animal, fungus, and protist on Earth today. It was the ancestor of us. During the boring billion, these eukaryotes are present, but they have not yet taken over. They are one player among many. We find their fossilized ghosts in the rock record, tiny single-celled spheres, sometimes with simple spines or ornamentation. They are known as acrotarchs. For a billion years, the story of the acrotarchs is one of remarkable sameness. Their diversity is low, and their rate of evolutionary change is glacial. They appear in the rock record and then they just persist. These early eukaryotes were likely predators but on a microscopic scale. They were larger than bacteria, and they could engulf their smaller, simpler neighbors, digesting them for food. This was the beginning of the predator-prey relationship, the first faint echo of the great dance of eat or be eaten that drives so much of modern evolution. But for some reason during this eon that dance never escalated. The eukaryotes hunted bacteria, but nothing hunted the eukaryotes. The arms race of evolution, where prey develops defenses and predators develop better weapons, had not yet kicked off. Why did these new, complex cells, with their superior energy production and protected DNA, not immediately outcompete the prokaryotes and radiate into 1,000 different forms? Why did they not clump together to form the first simple animals or plants? They had the toolbox. The nucleus allowed for complex genetic instructions, and the mitochondria provided the power needed for a larger, more active lifestyle. Yet, for a billion years they remained for the most part single-celled and simple. This is a crucial part of the puzzle. The protagonists of the story, the characters who held all the potential for the future, seem to have been stuck in the first act. It is as if an actor has been given a brilliant script, but for some reason refuses to say their lines. They just stand on the stage waiting. Perhaps the environment was the problem. Perhaps these new high-powered eukaryotic cells had a weakness. They required not just oxygen, but also specific trace metals to build their complex internal machinery elements like zinc, copper, and molybdenum. Were these essential building blocks simply not available in the oceans of the boring billion? Or perhaps the problem was the competition. The prokaryotes had a 2 billion year head start. They were tough, efficient, and perfectly adapted. Maybe the early eukaryotes were simply not that much better. They could carve out a niche for themselves, but they couldn't break the dominance of the bacterial world. They were living in the margins of a world still fundamentally ruled by the simpler, older forms of life. The cast of characters is set. The humble, resilient prokaryotes, masters of metabolic chemistry, and the promising but strangely quiescent eukaryotes, holding the spark of future complexity. These are our players. For a billion years they shared the world stage, performing a slow, unchanging play. To understand why, we must now look away from the players themselves and turn our attention to the stage, the geology, chemistry, and atmosphere of this long-forgotten world. Section 4. A Planet in Lockdown. Having met the humble protagonists of our story, let us now turn our attention to the stage itself. Could it be that the long evolutionary pause was not due to a failure of life, but a failure of the planet? Was the world of the boring billion a cage, carefully constructed by geology, that kept life simple? This is the geological hypothesis, and it centers on the grandest character of all, the supercontinent. As we have seen, the Earth's continents are not fixed. They are constantly in motion, driven by the slow churning of the mantle below. They gather together into vast supercontinents, and then they are torn apart again in a majestic cyclical rhythm. The boring billion coincides almost perfectly with the lifespan of two of these great landmasses. It began shortly after the assembly of a supercontinent named Columbia or Nuna, and it took place largely during the long, stable reign of the next supercontinent, Rodinia. Imagine Rodinia, a single colossal landmass dominating one hemisphere of the planet. As we explored in our previous journey, This was a world of stark barren rock. But the shape and existence of this supercontinent had a profound, and perhaps stifling, effect on the oceans and the life within them. The engine of life in the oceans is driven by nutrients. Just like a garden on land, the microscopic phytoplankton in the sea need fertilizer to grow. These are elements like phosphorus, nitrogen, and crucial trace metals like iron, molybdenum, and zinc. And the ultimate source of these nutrients is the land. In our modern world with its scattered continents, there is a vast network of mountain ranges. Think of the Rockies, the Andes, the Alps, the Himalayas. These mountains are constantly being pushed upwards by tectonic activity. This upward movement exposes fresh rock to the wind and rain. This process, called weathering, breaks down the rock and dissolves its minerals. Rivers then act like a global delivery service, washing these life-giving nutrients from the eroding mountains down into the sea. This constant supply of fertilizer from the land fuels the productivity of the oceans. But what happens in a supercontinent world? For much of the boring billion, the Earth's tectonic engine seems to have quieted down. The great, continent-crushing collisions that build mountains had already happened when Rodinia was assembled. For hundreds of millions of years, the supercontinent was tectonically stable. There was little active mountain building. The mountains that had been created during the continent's assembly were now simply being worn down. Without active uplift exposing new rock, the process of erosion would have slowed dramatically. The land surface would have become old, weathered, and stripped of its easily accessible nutrients. The rivers flowing into the ocean would have carried less and less fertilizer. The result would have been a nutrient famine in the oceans. The phytoplankton, the base of the food web, would have been starved. Their populations would have been kept at a low, stable level, limited by the scarcity of essential building blocks. And if the base of the food web is starved, the entire ecosystem is starved. The early eukaryotic predators, who fed on these phytoplankton and bacteria, would have had their food supply capped. There simply wasn't enough energy or raw materials in the system to support larger bodies or more complex food webs. Life was trapped in a low-energy, low-nutrient equilibrium. It had reached the carrying capacity of a nutrient-poor world. There was no surplus of energy to fuel innovation. Evolution was not paused because of a lack of imagination, but because of a lack of resources. It was a planet on a strict budget. The very shape of the supercontinent would have exacerbated this problem. Rodinia was a huge solid landmass. The majority of its interior was thousands of miles from the ocean. This vast, dry heartland would have contributed very little nutrient runoff to the sea. The action was all happening on the coasts, but the coastline of one supercontinent is far, far shorter than the combined coastlines of many smaller continents. The area for nutrient exchange between land and sea was limited. So, the geological hypothesis paints a compelling picture. A tectonically stable supercontinent, with few active mountain ranges, slowly starves the oceans of the essential nutrients needed for life to thrive and complexify. The planet itself was in lockdown, and life was a prisoner of this geological quiet. Section 5: The Sulfuric Trap. While the geological lockdown provides a powerful explanation for the long pause, some scientists believe the cage was not made of rock, but of chemistry. To understand this, we must dive deep into the oceans of the boring billion, below the sunlit surface layer, into a strange and alien world of chemical stratification. This is the chemical hypothesis, and it suggests that life was trapped not just by a lack of nutrients but by a wall of poison. Let's revisit the oceans of this ancient world. The top layer, the photic zone, is where we find our familiar protagonists. But if you were to dive deeper, you would cross a threshold, a chemical boundary called a chemocline. The mystery is what replaced the oxygen in these deep waters. In our modern oceans, the deep is mostly anoxic, but it's not particularly reactive. During the boring billion, however, scientists believe the deep ocean was not just anoxic, it was euxinic. This means it was anoxic and rich in dissolved hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gives rotten eggs their characteristic smell. Imagine a world where the deep ocean was a vast, stagnant reservoir of poisonous, sulfidic water. This would have created a profound chemical trap. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to most eukaryotes. It shuts down their aerobic metabolism. Any complex organism trying to venture into the depths, or any life trying to rise from the depths, would have been met with this invisible chemical wall. The deep ocean was a no-go zone, a realm of death for any aspiring complex life. Where did all this sulfur come from? Came from bacteria. In the anoxic depths, a different kind of microbe ruled, the sulfate-reducing bacteria. They performed a different kind of respiration. Instead of breathing oxygen, they breathed sulfate, a common ion in seawater. So we have a stratified ocean like a layered cocktail. A thin oxic layer on top, full of cyanobacteria and simple eukaryotes, and a vast, deep euxinic layer below, full of sulfate-reducing bacteria. The boundary between them was a chemical war zone. This sulfuric trap would have had devastating consequences for the evolution of complexity. Firstly, it restricted the available habitat. Eukaryotes, the hope for the future, were confined to the shallow, oxygenated surface waters. Their playground was a fraction of the full volume of the ocean. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it locked away the very nutrients that life needed. Remember the nutrient famine from our geological hypothesis? Euxinia would have made it catastrophically worse. Hydrogen sulfide is incredibly reactive with metals. When vital trace metals like molybdenum, copper, and iron, essential for building the complex proteins that eukaryotes rely on, were washed into the sea from the land, they would sink. As soon as they hit the sulfidic deep waters, they would immediately react with the hydrogen sulfide and precipitate out, forming insoluble metal sulfide minerals that fell to the seafloor. The deep ocean was actively scrubbing the water of the very elements life needed to get complex. Molybdenum, for example, is a crucial component of the enzymes that allow organisms to fix nitrogen, another essential nutrient. Without molybdenum, nitrogen fixation would have been crippled, placing another severe limit on the productivity of the oceans. Life was caught in a vicious cycle. The low oxygen levels allowed the sulfidic deep ocean to exist. The sulfidic deep ocean then locked away the trace metals that were needed to fuel the biological pump and create more organic matter. This, in turn, kept oxygen levels low. It was a planetary-scale, self-reinforcing chemical trap. The world was stuck. The prokaryotes, both the cyanobacteria at the top and the sulfate reducers at the bottom, were perfectly happy with this arrangement. Their simple metabolisms did not require the same complex suite of trace metals as the eukaryotes. The world was perfectly tuned for them. But for the eukaryotes, the pioneers of complexity, it was a prison. They had the engine for a more complex life, the mitochondria, but they were being starved of the fuel, nutrients, and the specialized parts, trace metals, needed to build a better machine. To break out of this sulfuric trap, the planet needed a shock to the system. It needed a way to mix the oceans, to ventilate the deeps, and to shut down the sulfide factory. This might have come from the rifting of Rodinia, which would have changed ocean circulation patterns, or from the global snowball Earth glaciations that followed, which may have powerfully overturned the oceans and infused them with oxygen. Only by breaking this chemical stratification could the world finally be freed, allowing the oceans to become fully oxygenated and paving the way for the rise of animals. Section 6: The Oxygen Plateau. We have explored the planet as a geological prison and the oceans as a chemical trap. But there is a third possibility, one that lies not in the rocks or the water, but in the air itself. What if the long pause was caused by a planetary Goldilocks problem? What if, for a billion years, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere was stuck at a level that was just right for simple life, but too low for anything more complex? This is the atmospheric hypothesis, the idea of the Great Oxygen Plateau. Let's revisit the Great Oxidation Event. It was a revolution, but it was not a complete victory for oxygen. After the initial, violent rise, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere did not continue to climb steadily. Instead, it hit a ceiling and leveled off. For the entire duration of the boring billion, atmospheric oxygen is thought to have hovered at a tiny fraction of modern levels, perhaps between 1% and 10% of what we breathe today. Imagine trying to live your life at the top of the highest mountain on Earth, where the air is perilously thin. This was the atmospheric condition of the entire planet for a billion years. This level of oxygen was a perfect compromise for the microbial world. It was high enough to support the new, efficient aerobic metabolism of many bacteria and the early eukaryotes. But for the future of complex life, this plateau was a barrier. Building an animal is an energy-intensive business. You need to build a body with specialized tissues, muscles for movement, nerves for sensing, a gut for digestion. You need to grow large enough to be a predator or to escape one. All of this requires a tremendous amount of energy, and the primary way to get that energy is by burning fuel, food, with oxygen. The low oxygen levels of the boring billion would have acted as an oxygen ceiling on the aspirations of life. A single-celled eukaryote could get by just fine. It has a large surface area compared to its volume, so the meager oxygen could easily diffuse into the cell. But if you try to build something bigger, you run into a problem. An organism made of many cells has a much lower surface area to volume ratio. It becomes much harder to get enough oxygen to all the cells in the interior of the body. Without high levels of atmospheric oxygen, large active animals were simply not metabolically possible. The energy budget wouldn't balance. Life may have tried to become more complex, but it would have immediately run up against this fundamental atmospheric limit. An early proto-animal would have been slow, sluggish, and constantly struggling for breath in the thin air world. It was an evolutionary dead end. Furthermore, one of the key components for building animal bodies is collagen. It is the protein that acts as the scaffolding for our tissues, the glue that holds our cells together. The synthesis of collagen is a complex biochemical process, and it requires a significant amount of molecular oxygen. It's possible that during the boring billion, there simply wasn't enough oxygen in the environment for life to reliably manufacture this crucial building block of animal life. Without collagen, you cannot build a body. So why was the oxygen level stuck on this plateau for so long? This brings us back to our other hypotheses. The nutrient famine caused by a stable supercontinent would have limited the amount of photosynthesis, thus capping oxygen production at its source. The sulfuric deep oceans would have acted as a massive oxygen sink, consuming any excess that was produced. The geology, chemistry, and atmosphere were all locked together in a self-regulating loop that kept oxygen levels low and stable. Think of the planet's oxygen budget as a bank account. Photosynthesis is the income. Respiration and decay are the regular expenses. But during the boring billion, there were also huge hidden costs. The weathering of certain rocks on the continents and the chemical reactions in the sulfidic oceans were constantly draining oxygen from the system. The income from photosynthesis was only just enough to cover the expenses, leaving no surplus in the bank. The account balance remained low and unchanging for a billion years. Life was caught in an oxygen trap. To evolve, it needed more oxygen. But to get more oxygen, it needed to photosynthesize more. To photosynthesize more, it needed more nutrients. But the geology of the supercontinent and the chemistry of the oceans were holding nutrients back. Breaking out of this trap required a fundamental change in the planet's budget. The rifting of Rodinia and the end of the sulfuric oceans would have reduced the expenses, while simultaneously increasing the income, by providing a new flood of nutrients to fuel photosynthesis. It was only when the planet's geological and chemical state changed, at the end of the boring billion, that the oxygen bank account could finally begin to grow. This second wind of oxygenation, leading up to the levels we have today, was the final key needed to unlock the door to the animal kingdom. The long atmospheric peace was over, and the race for a high-energy world could begin. Section 7. The Price of Perfection. We have searched for the bars of life's prison in the rocks, in the seas, and in the air. But what if there was no prison? What if the door was open all along, and life simply chose not to walk through it? This leads us to our most introspective and perhaps unsettling hypothesis, the biological hypothesis. What if the long pause was not a failure of the environment, but a consequence of life's own success? Let us return to the microscopic world of the boring billion. The main characters, the prokaryotes and the simple eukaryotes, had achieved a remarkable state of grace. They were, in their own way, perfect. The cyanobacteria had perfected the art of photosynthesis in a low-nutrient world. The other bacteria had mastered every conceivable metabolic trick, from breathing oxygen to breathing sulfate, iron, or nitrate. They were resilient, efficient, and could replicate with astonishing speed. They had conquered every available chemical niche on the planet. And what about our hopeful protagonists, the eukaryotes? They too had found their perfect niche. As single-celled predators, they were the kings of their microscopic castle. They were larger and more complex than the bacteria they hunted, giving them a distinct advantage. With their efficient mitochondria, they had all the energy they needed to power their single-celled lives. They were the apex predators of a world that was too small to see. This state of perfection may have been the problem. Evolution is not a conscious force, striving towards a goal like complexity or animals. It is simply a process of finding what works best in a given environment. And in the stable, unchanging environment of the boring billion, the single-celled lifestyle was what worked best. There was no evolutionary pressure to change because the existing model was so successful. This leads to a concept known as evolutionary fitness landscapes. Imagine a landscape with hills and valleys. The elevation of any point on the landscape represents how fit or successful an organism with a certain set of traits would be. The goal of evolution is simply to climb to the nearest peak. During the boring billion, life had climbed to a very comfortable, very wide, and very high peak, the peak of perfect unicellularity. Any mutation that tried to push an organism off this peak, say, by making cells stick together to form a simple clump, would have been punished by natural selection. Why? Because that simple clump might have been less efficient at absorbing scarce nutrients than a free-floating single cell. It might have been slower or less able to reproduce. It would have found itself in a valley of lower fitness between the peak it was on and some other, distant, undiscovered peak of true multicellularity. Evolution, which operates one small step at a time, would always favor the immediate advantage, pushing the organism back up to the safety of the single-celled peak. Life was trapped by its own success. It had reached a local optimum, and the path to a better, more complex optimum was hidden behind a valley of failure. To cross that valley would require a huge leap, something evolution is not equipped to do, or a massive change in the landscape itself. The prokaryotes, the ancient rulers, may have also played the role of gatekeepers. Their sheer numbers and metabolic efficiency would have made them ferocious competitors. Any new eukaryotic experiment that was not immediately successful would have been outcompeted for resources by the vast, incumbent bacterial population. The bacteria were, in effect, preventing the eukaryotes from gaining the evolutionary foothold needed to start experimenting with more complex forms. So the boring billion may not have been an era of stagnation, but an era of intense, cutthroat competition that resulted in a perfect stalemate. Everyone was so good at what they were doing that no one could get the upper hand and change the game. The ecosystem was locked in. This perspective recasts the boring billion not as a time of failure, but as a time of refinement. For 1,000 million years, the eukaryotic cell was being perfected. Its internal machinery, its genetic code, its metabolic pathways, all were being fine-tuned in the competitive crucible of the microbial world. It was a long, slow period of research and development, happening behind the scenes. Life was not paused, it was preparing. It was mastering the skills it would need for the next great leap. But it was waiting for the landscape to change, for the world to provide a new set of challenges that would make its old peak obsolete and reveal the path to a new one. From this viewpoint, the long quiet was not a prison imposed from the outside, but a state of equilibrium achieved from within. The stasis was the result of a biological system that had found a perfect, stable solution to the problems of its world. Section 8. Whispers in the Dark. Our journey so far has painted the boring billion as an age of quiet, of stasis, of grand-scale waiting. We've seen a world locked down by geology, trapped by chemistry, capped by a thin atmosphere, and perhaps even held in a stalemate by its own biological success. It is easy to imagine this eon as a lost time, a billion years in which the script of life went unwritten. But this picture of a world in perfect suspended animation is not entirely true. Even in the deepest quiet, there are whispers. Even in the darkest theater, actors are rehearsing backstage. Let us look past the fossil record of simple, unchanging spheres and search for the hidden clues of progress. This was not an era of dramatic external change, but of profound internal innovation. The great work of the boring billion was happening inside the eukaryotic cell, in the silent, intricate dance of its molecules and genes. One of the most crucial inventions perfected during this time was sex. Sexual reproduction. We find the first plausible evidence for it in a 1.2-billion-year-old fossilized red algae called Bangiomorpha. This humble organism produced two different kinds of spores, believed to be the first specialized male and female reproductive cells. This was a game-changer of monumental importance. For the first 2 billion years of life, organisms reproduced asexually, simply by dividing in two. This is a fast and efficient way to make copies, but it is not a good way to create novelty. The only source of variation is random mutation. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, is a revolutionary way to shuffle the genetic deck. By combining the genes from two different parents, it creates new combinations in every generation. This process dramatically accelerates the pace of evolution. It allows beneficial mutations that arise in different individuals to be brought together in a single descendant. It creates a vast pool of genetic diversity, a storehouse of options that can be drawn upon when the environment changes. The perfection of sexual reproduction during the boring billion was like a software upgrade for the engine of evolution. Life was preparing a new tool that would allow it to adapt with incredible speed when the long stasis finally broke. Another quiet revolution was the dawn of cooperation. While complex animals had not yet appeared, the first tentative steps towards multicellularity were being taken. In the fossil record, we see eukaryotes that lived in simple colonies. They were not yet true multicellular organisms with specialized cells, but they were learning to live together, to coordinate their behavior, and perhaps to share resources. They were experimenting with the fundamental rules of social life at a cellular level. Inside the cell, another critical process was being refined: the management of a complex genome. The eukaryotic genome is vastly larger and more intricate than a prokaryote's. It's not just a simple loop of DNA, but multiple long strands, chromosomes, packed with genes, regulatory switches, and vast stretches of what was once called junk DNA. During the boring billion, the cell was perfecting the incredibly complex molecular machinery needed to copy this huge library of information without errors, to repair damage, and to control which genes were turned on and off. This sophisticated gene regulation, or epigenetics, is the key to creating different types of cells like nerve cells, muscle cells, and skin cells, from the very same genetic blueprint. The foundations of developmental biology were being laid. And what about the predators? Those single-celled eukaryotic hunters were driving a hidden arms race. As they became more efficient hunters, their prey, the bacteria and smaller eukaryotes, would have been under selective pressure to evolve defenses. Perhaps they developed tougher cell walls, or learned to move faster or produce chemical deterrents. In response, the predators would have evolved better ways to hunt. This microscopic dance of eat or be eaten, though it didn't lead to large animals, was sharpening the tools of predation and evasion. It was a silent, invisible arms race that was priming the pump for the larger, more visible arms race of the Cambrian explosion. The boring billion then was not an empty age. It was a period of deep preparation. It was life's long, quiet adolescence. On the outside, it may have looked like nothing was changing, but on the inside, everything was being made ready. It was the time when life learned to mix its genes, to talk to its neighbors, to manage its internal library, and to compete in a more sophisticated way. Think of it as the long, quiet training montage in a grand cinematic epic. The hero is not yet facing the great dragon, but is in the mountains honing their skills, forging their sword, and studying the ancient maps. The story seems to have paused, but this quiet time of preparation is what will make the final victory possible. Without the silent innovations of the boring billion, without the perfection of sex, genetic control, and cellular cooperation, the explosive creativity that followed would have been impossible. The whispers in the dark were the prologue to the main event, the essential and patient work that laid the foundations for the entire animal kingdom to come. Section 9. The Great Unlocking. For a billion years, the world was held in a state of delicate, stable equilibrium. The planetary chess game was a perfect stalemate, but no stalemate lasts forever. Toward the end of the boring billion, around 800 million years ago, the board was violently overturned. The long quiet was shattered by a series of planetary-scale convulsions that fundamentally changed the rules of the game. This was the Great Unlocking, the moment when the caged doors were finally broken and life was set free. The primary trigger for this global revolution was the death of a supercontinent. Rodinia, the great landmass that had dominated the planet for so long, began to break apart. As we have seen, the supercontinent was its own undoing, trapping the mantle's heat until the pressure from below became too great. Great rifts tore across the land, a process that would have released a geological and chemical torrent upon the world. Imagine the scene. As the continent began to stretch and crack, vast volcanic eruptions known as flood basalts poured across the landscape. These eruptions, lasting for millions of years, spewed enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. But more importantly, they brought a flood of new rock, rich in essential nutrients, to the Earth's surface. As the rifts widened and the sea flooded in, new, shallow oceans were created. These new oceans had rugged, fresh coastlines, and the intense volcanism on the new seafloor created hydrothermal vent systems, all pumping a rich cocktail of minerals: phosphorus, iron, and those vital trace metals like molybdenum into the water. The nutrient famine was over. The effect on life would have been immediate and dramatic. The phytoplankton, their growth no longer limited by a lack of fertilizer, would have bloomed on a global scale. The base of the food web, which had been so meager for so long, suddenly became robust and abundant. With more food available, the entire ecosystem could support more life and more complex life. As these massive plankton blooms lived and died, they sank into the depths. This huge influx of organic matter had a profound effect. It began to consume the hydrogen sulfide in the deep, euxinic waters, cleansing the poisonous trap that had persisted for so long. Furthermore, as these organisms were buried on the seafloor, their carbon was removed from the system. The burial of this much carbon, which was not decomposed, meant that the oxygen produced during its creation was not used up. It was a net gain for the atmosphere. The oxygen plateau began to crumble. With a renewed source of nutrients and the closing of the sulfuric sink, the planet's oxygen budget was no longer balanced. The income began to exceed the expenses, and the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere started to rise, for the first time in a billion years. The oxygen ceiling that had prevented the evolution of large animals was beginning to crack. But the breakup of Rodinia had an even more dramatic consequence. The creation of new oceans and the weathering of all that fresh volcanic rock began to draw enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, out of the atmosphere. The planet's thermostat was tampered with, and the Earth began to cool. It cooled so much that it plunged the planet into the most extreme ice ages it has ever known. These were the snowball Earth events of the Cryogenian period. For millions of years at a time, the entire planet may have frozen over, from the poles to the equator, entombing the world in a shell of ice perhaps a mile thick. This would have been the ultimate environmental filter. Life would have been pushed to the very brink of extinction, surviving only in tiny refuges, perhaps in sunlit cracks in the ice, or around warm volcanic vents on the seafloor. Each snowball event was a near-total reset for life on Earth. But paradoxically, these cataclysmic glaciations may have been the final key to unlocking complexity. As the glaciers ground the continents, they pulverized the rock, creating a massive store of nutrient-rich dust. When the ice finally retreated, melted by the slow buildup of volcanic CO2 in the atmosphere, this dust would have been washed into the sea, providing another massive pulse of fertilizer and triggering yet more biological productivity and oxygenation. Moreover, the intense selective pressure of these events would have favored organisms with new and resilient strategies. The survivors of Snowball Earth were the toughest, most adaptable organisms the planet had ever produced. The old stable world of the boring billion was gone, replaced by a violent, unpredictable cycle of deep freeze and hothouse thaw. The old perfect solutions no longer worked. The fitness landscape was now a chaotic, churning seascape. The old, comfortable peaks had been flattened, and new, higher peaks of opportunity were rising from the chaos. The stalemate was broken. The prison had been demolished. The world that emerged from the final Snowball Earth event around 635 million years ago was a new world. It was a world with higher oxygen levels, nutrient-rich oceans, and a dynamic, challenging climate. All the secret innovations that life had been perfecting during the long, quiet sexual reproduction, genetic control, cooperation could now be put to use in this new opportunity-rich environment. The stage was finally set. The long, quiet adolescence was over. Life, forged in fire and ice, was now ready to take its next great step. It was ready to become big, to become complex, to become animal. The boring billion was over, and the curtain was about to rise on the Cambrian explosion. Section 10. Legacy of the Long Pause. As we look back on this immense, quiet eon from the shores of our own complex world, it is easy to cast the boring billion as a failure. A billion years of lost time. A planetary story stuck on a blank page. But to see it this way is to miss the profound and beautiful point of the long pause. The boring billion was not a bug in the system. It was a fundamental and necessary feature. It was not an era of stagnation, but an era of foundation building. It was the deep, silent, and essential groundwork that made everything that followed possible. Without the long, stable reign of the supercontinents, the Earth might never have settled into the kind of equilibrium needed to perfect the eukaryotic cell. The constant geological chaos of a more dynamic world might have been too disruptive. The boring billion provided a calm, predictable laboratory where life could work on its most intricate internal problems without distraction. It was a time for life to get its own house in order before building a city. Without the nutrient famine and the low oxygen atmosphere, life might have taken a different and perhaps less successful path. If resources had been plentiful from the start, perhaps a form of life less efficient and less complex than the eukaryote might have dominated. The harsh conditions of the boring billion acted as a powerful selective filter, ensuring that only the most robust and sophisticated cellular design would ultimately succeed. It forced life to become clever and efficient, to master its own internal chemistry. Think of the boring billion as the long, slow curing of the concrete foundation of a skyscraper. To a passerby, it looks like nothing is happening for an incredibly long time. The site is quiet. There is no visible progress. But this slow, invisible process of strengthening is the most critical part of the entire construction. If you rush it, if you start building the tower before the foundation is fully set, the entire structure will be unstable and will ultimately collapse. The biological innovations of the boring billion, the perfection of the eukaryotic cell, the invention of sexual reproduction, the development of sophisticated genetic regulation were that concrete foundation. All the complexity we see today, from the intricate wiring of our own brains to the delicate architecture of a flower, is built upon the quiet work done during that long pause. We are the skyscraper, and the boring billion is the unseen, but absolutely essential foundation beneath our feet. The end of the boring billion teaches us another profound lesson, that great leaps forward are often born from great crises. The stable, perfect world of the microbes had to be destroyed to make way for the world of animals. It took the cataclysmic breakup of a continent and the planet-encasing trauma of Snowball Earth to break the stalemate and unlock life's hidden potential. It is a recurring theme in our planet's history. Stability can lead to stagnation, while catastrophe can be a catalyst for creativity. And so we can finally see the boring billion not as a pause, but as a purposeful quiet. It was the planet breathing in slowly and deeply, gathering its strength and potential before the great, explosive exhalation of the Cambrian. It was a necessary silence, the quiet before the symphony. Every animal that has ever swum or walked or flown owes its existence to the patient, unseen work performed by our single-celled ancestors in the lonely oceans of that long-lost world. As you settle into the quiet of your own evening, think of that immense planetary stillness. Think of the slow, patient work of evolution, unfolding over a timescale that defies our comprehension. Our restless, noisy, complex world is built upon a foundation of 1 billion years of silence. Let that deep, ancient quiet seep into your awareness, a reminder that not all progress is loud, and that great things are often born from long periods of patient, silent preparation. Let it soothe you into a deep and peaceful rest. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the immense, quiet ocean of deep time. Feel the gentle, slow rhythm of a world at rest, a world gathering its strength. Our own lives have moments of quiet, of pause that can feel like stagnation, but perhaps like the boring billion. These are just times of silent preparation, the deep and necessary groundwork for the next chapter of our own story. Let this thought bring you comfort and guide you into a peaceful and restorative sleep. Good night.